So let's think about experts. Do I keep cutting out? Or no? Oh, okay. So, expert, it's interesting to me that at the root of the word expert, there is this idea of trying, that trying is an action and a gesture that doesn't necessarily presume a successful outcome. I mean, I guess you can't really become expert until you try things, and through trial and error, learn how to recognize something that works or that doesn't work. So I have no problem with expertise. I think expertise is great. But let's consider the word dilettante. So I don't know if you all know what dilettante means. One thing I really love to do, and research suggestion, when you're interested in something, just do a Google image search, and often the first, on that grid of however many images, you'll almost always find a preponderance of one thing. I tried to do that with dilettante because I imagined that I would see all these people in dandyish clothes sitting around not doing anything or something, but it didn't really work because apparently a lot of people like to brand their companies with dilettante, so it's a pretty heterogeneous mix of things. So the word dilettante typically is a bit pejorative. It's a put down. It's a dilettante is somebody who just kind of dabbles in things, samples them, but doesn't really commit, doesn't really dig into any one thing. That's somebody who doesn't become expert. But what I love about this definition is that it comes from the root to delight, that there's something very pleasurable about being a dilettante, that for me, I may be taking this a bit too far, but there's this undertone of curiosity and joy and delight in learning about things, learning about all kinds of different things. Also, this timeline thing is super interesting because you can see where usage is at peak. Apparently, people were really dilettantish around World War II, which doesn't really make much sense to me. But so I've sort of joked over the last little bit that in humanities, the thing that expertise sort of presumes is that you have this reader in you. You've probably picked up one on occasion, like the Rutledge Guide to child studies in hair dyeing or something like that, and they get really specific. I think that if I ever do one, I'm going to write the Rutledge Companion to Dilettantism, because I think that there's something useful about opening up onto lots of things and delighting in them. So the reason why I gave you that little bio of my trajectory through university is that I felt like a dilettante for a really long time in the pejorative, negative sense of the word. But when I was asked to do this art exhibition, I started to realize that all these things that I've been doing, running a record label and being a composer and musician, I was doing a lot of renovating, so I learned a lot about construction and building. I was in this PhD program doing lots of research on the history of technology and sound recording and cultural studies and stuff like that. And those things, again, they always feel really disconnected, but when I started to create work for this exhibition, it suddenly started to all take form. So the genesis of a lot of the pieces that I was making were coming out of the research that I was doing. So these pieces would become not necessarily like essays on the things I was interested in, but they just became these manifestations of the ideas I was working with that started to suggest really different ways of doing thought and doing research. And I'll talk a bit more about that later, but that's something that's become really important to me. So I'm going to show you a few pieces, and I'm just going to try and pull out some ideas about interdisciplinarity, dilettantism, collaboration, and I'm going to explain, we'll see how many I get through depending on time, but I'll just sort of go through the research that I was doing at the time and how that manifested in a material object or in a collaboration or something. And then the other definition I want to just toss out there too to have you consider is another one I like quite a lot, which is a polymath, so meaning having learned much. So I don't know. I don't know if polymaths delight in the same way that dilettantes do. So maybe there's a compound word. Like if this were German, we would just shove them together, and then we'd have a one who delights in knowing a lot. Or maybe we can combine all three, expert, polymath, and dilettante, into the same phrase as an ideal. So the first piece I'm going to show you is one of the pieces that came out of that first exhibition that came up very, very serendipitously. So it's a piece called Sound, or the Noise No Writing Can Store. So the genesis of this piece was that I was reading this German media theorist named Friedrich Kittler, and he tells this really, he writes about this Rainer Maria Rilke essay that I thought was just, it really stuck with me somehow. So the essay is about Rilke imagining if you had a human skull and how they're called the coronal sutures. Here, so this is that is an actual human skull. My dad is a dentist, and I now have it in my possession. He gave it to me because he's winding down his practice. But so you see at the top there, those wavy lines, and that's called the coronal suture. So you have these sutures in your skull, and when you're a little baby in utero, your skull is kind of deflated, and then when you come out, eventually it grows. It inflates with your giant brain, and then it gets sort of stitched together and becomes solid, so that you can pass through the birth canal, but then it opens up. So Rilke was looking at a skull, or imagining a skull, thinking, wow, the sutures look like the grooves of a phonograph record. If we were to play, well, actually, maybe I'll just read the passage from the essay. So he wrote, what is it that repeatedly presents itself to my mind? It is this: the coronal suture of the skull, this would first have to be investigated, has, let us assume, a certain similarity to the closely wavy line which the needle of a phonograph engraves on the receiving rotating cylinder of the apparatus. What if one what if one changed the needle and directed it on its return journey along a tracing which was not derived from the graphic translation of a sound, but existed of itself naturally? Well, to put it plainly, along the coronal suture, for example, what would happen? A sound which would necessarily result, a series of sounds, music, feelings, which, incredulity, timidity, fear, awe, which of all the feelings here possible prevents me from suggesting a name for the primal sound, which would then make its appearance in the world? So I've never really been able to figure out whether he's being silly or whether he fully believes that there's some sort of coded message inscribed in all of our skulls, but either way, it just stuck with me. And so one day when I was preparing the work for this exhibition, I thought, well, what if I try this? So my dad loaned me his skull, and I detached the tone arm of my record player, and I dragged it through the coronal suture of the skull. And you can imagine, I didn't hear any messages, nothing spoke to me, it just sounded like noise. I have a video, so the video content is on my website. Maybe I'll play it for you, because it's funny. Yep. Oh, except now I'm not connected. Oh, I guess I'll go through the rest of the material from that, and then we'll get to the video portion. So I also want to show you part of what came of that exhibition was I put together a little book project, a book work that was kind of like, and this was before Pinterest, it was kind of like a mood board, but like an intellectual mood board for the work I was doing, the research that I was doing. And it was meant to, I guess one of the things I was struggling with in making this work is that there was a lot of research, and I could have written an essay about this stuff, but for some reason it seemed to want to come to into being as objects and experiences. So and this is still the case for me and my work, is I don't want it to feel like you have to read something or know something prior to experiencing it. I want it to be an experience. I want my works to be just to offer something or to create an impact regardless of the research that I know is there. So in this particular case, it was kind of an effort to just plant some seeds or open up the possibility of thinking that there was something else going on. And I also fully believe, I think some students from some of my studio classes that are here, and I always say that, even if you create a work that's really, really simple and austere or minimal, I think you can always feel when there's a lot of thought and research and commitment to intellectual propositions in a work, even if they're not very clear conceptually within the work. So to accompany this piece, this is the record. Sorry, I forgot to mention that I took the recording of the coronal suture dragging and had it rendered as a lathe-cut vinyl acrylic record that played. You could put the needle down, it would play, and then it would settle into a lock groove at the end, so there'd just be this. Oh, you'll hear it in a second. So this is the. This is the work that I was looking at and thinking at when I was developing this. So thinking about the skull and the possibility of the skull containing inscriptions that no human would have made, that there were possibly these inscriptions and messages that existed prior to any human authorship, got me thinking about this super interesting history of the skull as being something that, again, can communicate something about the individual. So there was this 19th century practice called phrenology that proposed that you could map the skull and there were certain zones that corresponded with certain traits or attributes or capacities, and that one of the kind of terrifying and strange things about it was that they were trying to determine what the criminal skull looked like. So you see these typological pictures of people who were in prison, and they would look at the features of their heads and say, oh, well, if you have criminals tend to have a flatter forehead and this and that, which of course is silly and not predictive of anything. But one thing that this blew my mind. So one thing that was not really that people couldn't really research was the skulls of virtuous, successful people. So often when criminals died, they'd be buried in unmarked graves or whatever, and they would be very easily disinterred for their skulls. But it was much harder to find the skulls of geniuses. Also, there are fewer geniuses, I guess. So there's this really big problem in the 19th century of skull theft. People would dig up, so the skull of Beethoven was stolen, the skull of Sir Thomas Browne was stolen, the skull of Mozart was stolen, and there was this trade in the skulls of great geniuses. And it was just such a strange and interesting story, but it also spoke to me of that idea that our bodies are authored, even if you don't believe in God, our bodies are authored somehow, and that they're recording devices and can be played back in a sense, and that was what I was trying to do with that piece. Another thing that I was thinking about while I was making that is, Brady mentioned my thesis supervisor, who is a super interesting, brilliant guy, and he wrote an amazing book about sound recording, the history of sound recording, called The Audible Past, and he makes this really interesting and compelling case that the technologies that we have around us, one of the typical stories is kind of like the great man theory of technology, which is there are all these like the cell phone is out there just waiting to be invented. All it takes is Steve Jobs and his team of engineers to pull it out of the ether, or the light bulb is just there waiting to be pulled out of the air by Edison. But Jonathan shows that, in fact, technology is really, really complicated, and often technologies can't even be imagined until there are certain cultural practices that are already in place that allow us to build upon ideas and existing objects to cobble together other things. So one of the things he writes about is this Victorian cult of death, basically, or not cult, but this preoccupation in Victorian North America and Europe around the mid-19th century. And so this is really fascinating to me, but one of the things that happened so Edison introduced the phonograph in 1877, but in the 1860s, you had the Civil War in the US. So Victorians were already really into making death masks and doing all sorts of things to preserve a likeness or preserve something. Have you seen those creepy Victorian hair artworks? So people would cut their hair and then braid it into these wreaths and things. And there's just a lot of production and consumption of bodies and body parts in ways. So during the Civil War, one of the big problems was that you had all these people going out and getting killed or injured in the heat of the Deep South. So two things were important inventions around that time. One was the development of chemical embalming. So people who were killed in the South, instead of their corpses rotting away and having to be buried where they lay, they could substitute all the fluids with these chemicals that would preserve the body, so their corpses could be shipped back north to be buried close to home. So preserving bodies. Another thing that was really important, and an important introduction that went hand in hand with the Civil War, was you had massive numbers of people to feed. And it was around this time that they developed the process for canning food. So putting food in a tin and then sterilizing it by boiling it so that you could preserve the food. So leading up to the phonograph, I don't know if you've seen this before, but the first phonographs that Thomas Edison developed were on a cylinder. So they weren't on a disc. They were the cylinder that would spin around, and the playback head would move, would catch the cylinder as it turned. So this composer named John Philip Sousa, who wrote those Sousa marches, he's the one who coined the term canned music. And when he said canned music, what he meant was this music that literally looks like a can and that isn't nearly as fresh as live Sousa marches. So that expression comes out of this conflation of the preserving of food with the preserving of sound. So this idea that you could, and initially Edison didn't even imagine that sound recording would be used for reproducing music. He has this really fantastic list of uses that he imagines for the phonograph, and it's like implanting voices in toy dolls. Like, I don't know how he imagined that a phonograph could be in a doll and make it talk, but that was one thing he wanted to do with it. And also recording and preserving the voice of great men was one of his projects. So already there was all these kind of constellations of preoccupation with death. Have you seen this image before? There are too many of you to actually expect you to nod and to get a sense, so I'm saying that rhetorically. This image, which I'm sure you've seen before, which is called His Master's Voice, is an image that media scholars have a field day with, because so what you might not notice or has been pointed out, and I'm not sure if anybody's ever really verified this, is that what you've got is this dog listening to, because of the title, his master's voice, which is recorded presumably on this gramophone, but the reflection of his feet on this makes it clear that it's a finished wooden surface, but that the fact that it kind of has that bevel there, people read that to be a coffin. So the story is that this is this man's dog listening to his voice while standing on his coffin. So it's this kind of gruesome, weird, circular kind of thing. Anyway, that was all in that piece that I just showed you. I'm not sure that anybody was really expected to get any of that, let alone all of it. But to me, it was just important that that was there. So that was the first time that I really realized that and some other pieces from this exhibition also included these built forms out of wood and stuff, and so the woodworking and building I had been doing kind of manifested in that way as well. So all of a sudden, this very nebulous, seemingly disconnected group of things that I was interested in, that I delighted in, became things that brought together, allowed me to start doing work and thinking in ways that I hadn't really considered before. So I'll just show you some other pieces, more recent pieces. I realized that I don't have any documentation. I couldn't find any documentation from the piece that Brady and I did together, but you can still see the sound mirrors if you look through the window down there. They're sitting at the back of the shop, and if you ask nicely, maybe Brady will let you test it out, but I don't want to annoy him. I'll show you this piece. This is a work that I did there was an exhibition at Ontario Place a few years ago called In Future, and it was this really ambitious, big public art thing. There were works commissioned for the whole site, and some of them were quite ambitious and big, and they showed films on the Cinesphere, the IMAX screen. It was really great. But I was commissioned to do a piece for this Japanese Buddhist temple bell, and I guess I was the first and probably the only Japanese-Canadian sound artist that they thought of. I'm not sure how many of us are out there, but I feel proud knowing that I'm first on the list of 1 or 3, maybe. So I started investigating the history of this piece because that's one of the first things that I do. Most of my work now is very, very site-specific. It will never be reproduced anywhere else because it is made materially for the location and for the whatever happens to be around, the architecture, et cetera. But it also, I'm really interested in making sure that it connects to what people understand of the place, what that place means to them. And as often as not, I'm doing research on the site to make sure that I don't do something that's really stupid and offensive. Like I'm working on a project for the Detroit Public Library right now, and my first thought was I better do some research so that I don't do more like Detroit ruin porn, because that's what anybody seems to do when they go to Detroit, is they take pictures of decaying buildings, and it's so spooky. So this research on site is usually something that manifests specifically in the work, but oftentimes it's just about understanding the context to the point that I can, honor it or be respectful of it. So in doing research for this piece, I found out, I told my dad about it, and he said, oh, well, your bachan, your grandmother, was at the inauguration of this bell. And so this bell was inaugurated in, now I'm going to tell you how old I am. It was inaugurated in 1977, and I was born in 1978. So all of a sudden it seemed totally significant that, I knew exactly what I had to do, because this bell connected me to my grandparents. But also, the bell was donated to, I don't remember which, I guess it was the city of Toronto by the Japanese government, and it was to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Japanese people arriving in Canada. But, as I hope you all know, the Japanese during World War II were all dispossessed and placed in concentration camps in the interior of BC, and my grandparents were among those people. So I started to think about this idea of monuments and commemorating something that was kind of neutral, like the arrival of Japanese people in Canada, but also the arrival of Japanese people in Canada foretold the eventual incarceration of an entire group of people based on ethnicity. So these things were just sort of percolating, and so I made this piece after my grandmother died, but before she did, I had this really wonderful practice or something of doing oral history with her. So she was always pretty withholding of stories about the internment, and the only way I could really get her to open up is I would sort of trick her into opening up by getting her to teach me how to make Japanese food. So she would be showing me how to make manju, like a Japanese dessert made of glutinous rice flour and red bean. And she'd just sort of be distracted with the process of it, and she would just start talking or answering questions in a way that she wouldn't if I sat with her on the couch with a microphone in her face. So I was doing this oral history with her, and what I ended up doing for the piece was taking a recording from those sessions with her and using a they're called tactile transducers. So they're speakers without the speaker cone, and when you attach them to an object, they vibrate and make that object vibrate, and so they make the object itself become the speaker. So I attached a tactile transducer to, speaking of sound, let's get this feeding back. Will it feed back? No. I just caught this weird echo from my Madonna headphone, or mic in this one.
Born in 1948, and I followed 30 years later in 1978. Street tip of downtown Toronto. I was to work with the Buddhist temple bell, a gift from the Japanese government to celebrate the centenary of the arrival of Japanese people in Canada. I learned that my grandparents had attended the inauguration ceremony, which took place in 1977, the year before I was born. I wanted to honor these threads of familial and national histories that converged at this site. It is Japanese Buddhist custom to ring the temple bell 108 times on New Year's Day, an act that signifies a cleansing and release from the 108 passions that cause our suffering. To honor my family's struggles and perseverance in Canada, I called on the spirit of my grandmother, who had passed away 5 years prior, whose stories I had been collecting in audio recordings for years, to sound the bell, to help release us all from suffering.
So the sound was pretty faint from the outside, but it was loud enough that it drew you in, and I think most people would go up into the bell expecting to see to see speakers or something playing from within the bell, but all you see is the top of that bronze dome on the inside. So what sort of seemed important to me about this piece was that it be very, very clear that you hear her voice, but not necessarily easy to understand what she was saying, that there was some sort of ghostly, hidden element to it. So basically her voice was activating that bell mechanically, and what I wanted to draw out in the title, you heard a bit of what I was describing in that. Oh, if you're doing voiceovers, hot tip, do not rely on side chaining. Doesn't work. I have to redo that because you can barely hear me anyway. So the title, 108 Specters of Release, there are, on New Year's Day, as I was saying in the video, you ring the bell, you strike the bell 108 times, and that's supposed to cleanse the world of these desires that hold us back from virtue or enlightenment or something. So initially I thought I was going to try and isolate 108 different frequencies, all according to significant dates in my family, and have those ring the bell, but that was really hard because it's hard to come up with numbers that represent 8,000 hertz or something. But again, this is, when you encounter this work on site, there's not much to announce what it is or what it's about. There was this I think it was this blurb here. So you got a little bit of background information, but for me it was really important that it just feel like what I meant and not necessarily describe literally or specifically what I was interested in. And then I will show you this piece, which I did this fall, which was kind of fun. So I had a show at the ICA in London, and again, my process was, as always, was to start doing research on the history of the site. And it turns out that the ICA is just a completely fascinating and strange institution. It was started in the 40s by this group of quite wealthy, connected, but also super transgressive and strange people. And it has kind of consistently been one of the more bizarre and creative institutions at the level of recognition that it has. But there are these really wild anecdotes. Actually, I'll go back because I don't have a picture of it in the video. You can't really see it very well. But one of the things that I learned from the curator who I was working with was that up in the offices, there is this, you find this thing, so it's like a plexiglass panel with what says, "This is Norman's blood." And so the story is that there was this encounter between an actor and one of the curators at the ICA, and the actor beat the crap out of this curator, and he bled all over the wall, and somebody had the great idea of putting it, of preserving it for all time. So yeah, that's Norman's blood. And so that started to open up onto the idea of, we're in an architecture faculty. I started thinking a lot about buildings and circulation, and found all kinds of fascinating stuff about how architects and architectural theorists have conceived as buildings in this weird anthropomorphic way for a really long time, and cities as well, but that these non-human entities have circulatory systems that kind of mimic or that are resonant with human circulatory systems. And so I started doing this very strange dive into trying to imagine buildings as themselves being maybe not conscious, but being, if you're familiar with this current in philosophy right now called object-oriented ontology, people are trying to take very seriously the idea that non-human things and things that aren't even necessarily mobile or sentient have agency, that they have an ability to influence the world according to things that they don't necessarily, like a rock doesn't, I don't know if a rock has desire, but a rock has a tendency to influence and to be an agent in a situation. So I started thinking about the building as an agent, and then I imagined that this building, which had been the container for apparently a lot of bloodshed, or some bloodshed, and a lot of conflict. The curator was telling me that there were it was kind of infamous as an institution for being a very tense place to work, partly because of the dynamism and the energy that went on there. And she told me this other anecdote that is what ended up kind of anchoring the piece as well, which was that in the 80s, there's a German industrial group called Einsturzende Neubauten, which I guess means collapse new buildings. And they're famous for, like, if you picture a sort of caricature of German industrial music, you are probably actually imagining them. So they would have cement mixers on stage and chainsaws and stuff. And so they played a concert at the ICA. And what happened was one of the members took out a jackhammer and started trying to jackhammer into the floor. And the reason was, so the ICA is on the Mall in London. You have Buckingham Palace here, Whitehall here, and the ICA is sort of in the middle. And supposedly, there's a network of tunnels that runs from underneath from Buckingham Palace to Whitehall, where the city government is. In the case of some sort of catastrophe, you could evacuate the royal family and Parliament and all these people through these tunnels. And so I guess Einstein and Neubauten knew about this, and they were supposedly trying to break into this hidden secret, this hidden circulatory system that would transmit wealth and power underneath the building itself. So all of these things were on my mind, and what I ended up deciding to do was I thought, this poor building, this poor room. And so the room effectively ends up having a panic attack. so what's happening here is I hacked into the lighting system of the room and installed an Arduino and a relay in between the panel and the lights. And so the flashing on and off is meant to mimic my heart rate. Initially, I had wired up a heart rate sensor to it, and so I could control the room with my heartbeat, but that just seemed a little too cute or something. And apologies to the Viz 303 students who are here because they've heard this at least once already, and they've witnessed it. Relays are dangerous. I shocked myself in front of my class the other day. I'm not sure. Maybe I shouldn't be telling you this. Maybe we're not supposed to be using 120 volt electricity. But yeah, so eventually the Arduino program, it goes on this loop, and it sort of randomly moves through stages where at various points it starts to get faster and slower and really erratic, and then ends up basically going into a rest. And it was a really intense experience to be in that room. And then the sonic elements are recordings of things that are then played back through those things. So like I tapped on the radiator and connected those tactile transducers to the radiator, so the radiator is playing back through the radiator, which made the room sort of feel like it was coming alive. And then you couldn't really hear it here, but there was this incredibly loud, intense, almost subsonic sound that was coming from this subwoofer. And the sound on that was I managed to find a recording of the Einstürzende Neubauten concert when they were trying to tunnel through the floor, and that was playing on the subwoofer. So it almost sounded like I wanted it to seem like Einstürzende Neubauten was in the middle of their concert downstairs. And again, like this stuff for me is important. I like to talk about it. It's what makes these pieces interesting to make, but it's really not all that important that be totally apparent when you experience the work. I guess maybe I'll just show you one more before we finish up and go into questions. So this is a recent work that I've been doing with a scientist, a biologist who used to be a postdoc in the biology department at U of T, and he's now gone on to a cushy job at Purdue in Indiana. But I had this, I don't know, I read this article years ago about how there had been this massive bee colony collapse in southern China, and this was the region that produced most of China's apples, and there was this big panic. Oh no, without any bees, how are we going to have apples? And so I remember that the article I read had this kind of parable structure. It was like, human degradation of the environment leads to the collapse of bees, which leads to no more apples, and there are these it makes these consequences kind of real if you can't have an apple because of human activity. But then what ended up happening was, because the labor in that region was so inexpensive, they ended up trying out having workers hand-pollinate the apple trees. So workers would go around with little pots of pollen and a paintbrush, and they would dab each flower with pollen. And guess what? That year, they tripled their apple yield. And so then the parable then goes to human ingenuity will always compensate and maybe even improve on nature's deficiencies that were because it's precarious and influenced by human activity. But then the article finished with this other kind of parable swerve, which is that as labor conditions improve in China, that it would no longer be economically viable to hand-pollinate apples. So then you're left with no apples again. So in that, something stuck with me, which was, well, what about honey? What happens to honey when we don't have any bees? So I had this idea for a long time, and I was really, really, really lucky to meet possibly one of the funniest, strangest, most creative scientists working today, my collaborator Brock Harper. And so we started this project's ongoing. A version of this was shown at OCAD in November. But the idea is that we're trying to do research on how to make honey by hand without bees. So that means the phase that we're at right now is that we walk around picking flowers and squeezing the nectar out of them and collecting them in test tubes. I actually see Miles in the back corner there. Miles Rufelds worked with me this summer, and we spent many hours sitting in cemeteries squeezing lilac blossoms and catalpa blossoms into jars, into the test tubes. So what we're doing is we're examining, or we're doing research on the enzymatic content of the bee gut, because this just blows my mind. So bees have two stomachs. One's like their digestive stomach, and another is called the crop, or the social stomach. And so when a bee ingests nectar from a flower, it will carry it in its social stomach, where it starts to mix with enzymes and stuff, but then it regurgitates it into other bees' mouths, which then increases the process of enzymatic mixing. So we're trying to replicate the bee gut outside of the bee gut, and we're trying to replicate that process of extracting the nectar that the bees do. And eventually, so we haven't gotten to the honey making aspect of it yet, but this is what we showed in this exhibition is... So we called it the curator called it like a pop-up mobile honey lab or something. So this is the fruit of many, many hours of labor. It's this tiny, tiny amount. Oh, and I taught myself to use the laser cutters to make these test tube racks because I thought that would look nice. Design. And then there were some samples of the catalpa nectar on a slide here that you could see. So the idea was basically that it was meant to really look like and read as a scientific workstation. And so what we're kind of interested in doing with this project is, again, like the whole thing about interdisciplinarity as a buzzword always presumes that, or seems to presume that people are going to get something from each other, that these collaborations are going to be about mobilizing people's skills to make something happen, and not necessarily about the people involved in the projects actually taking on those skills of those other people. So what I'm in the process of doing, I'm trying to publish my first scientific paper on it's like a methods paper on how to extract nectar from flowers. And it's kind of absurd, except that I read probably about 100 scientific journal articles on bees and bee nectar and honey production and stuff. And it's actually even less absurd than some of the stuff that is legitimate science. Like I read a paper about other methods for extracting nectar. So the conventional method is you take these tiny little glass tubes called microcapillaries, and you stick them into the nectaries, the nectar glands of the flower, and the capillary action sort of pulls up the nectar, and you end up with these tiny little tubes that have like microliters of nectar. And then you put them in a centrifuge and you spin the nectar out. And so somebody was proposing that way is just way too slow. Here's what you do. You take fabric and you wick it out of the flower. You take an absorbent material and you touch it to the nectar and it absorbs it, and then you dissolve it in a very specific amount of water, and then you evaporate the water, and then that's how much nectar you're left with. And that's real science. So we're toying with the ideas of publishing this stuff in fake journals, because one of the big problems in academia right now is these predatory journals, so these fake journals that are basically exploiting the precarity of the current academic labor situation by kind of promising this very easy way of publishing your work. So these journals, they're not legitimate. They're not peer reviewed. Some will just take your money. Some will you have to pay to publish. But we thought it was really an interesting possibility of publishing our fake real science in real fake journals. So one of the ideas that I guess I've been working at and coming up against in my work lately is this idea of working in bad faith. So I like the idea of faith because for faith to exist, you have to accept the premise of something. Like you have to believe in a a higher power, or you have to believe in the social contract. You have to believe in something and have faith in it to even start operating within that framework. So I'm trying to work with this idea of working in bad faith, where you accept the premise, you accept the existence of a social structure or something, but then you try to do it the wrong way. And I'm finding that really interesting things happen when I work in bad faith. And I don't mean bad faith in the sense of like maliciousness or something, but in the sense of just seeing what happens when you do things the wrong way and breaking things. And I think maybe that's like the dilettante spirit in me or something. So I guess I'm going to come full circle in a very literary way, and I'm going to wrap it up and say, in conclusion, don't tell your parents that a professor came up and told you to be dilettantes and to not take anything seriously. I'm not saying that you should be. Other students of mine who I can see are sick to death of me using the word rigor. I use the word rigor a lot. There's this really wonderful there's a wonderful passage in Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari's Thousand Plateaus, where they talk about medieval stonemasons and how medieval stonemasons would build these gigantic, incredibly complicated cathedrals without master plans. And how was it that they were able to, with compounding errors and everything, how are they able to build these structures that are so precise without having the idea of what it's going to be perfectly laid out in advance? And so they have this phrase that they describe medieval stonemasons as being inexact yet rigorous. So not inexact, but exactitude being this kind of thing that you suspend as you work, so that the rigor is the process of carving each stone, fitting it, and having the expertise and the foresight to know how they're going to lie with each other, but without it appealing to something that exists in advance. So, again, I'm not saying be lazy. I'm not saying, I'm just saying delight in knowledge and delight in all the knowledge that you encounter, and be rigorous and take it seriously, because I had a very unconventional path. I didn't see myself ending up in this particular situation necessarily, but it seems like all things led me here in the moment of recognition that all of the things that I loved and was really interested in were in fact not just, they weren't necessarily related, but that they could be collapsed into each other to make interesting things happen. So I will leave you with that. Thank you. I'm not sure what happens now.
We have time. Thank you, Mitchell. That was really excellent. And I just want to let the public know that we have time for maybe one or two questions. Yes.
Hello. So I'm going to ask, as I saw one of your projects called Torture and checked it out, why did you make a transition from generating peaceful sensory experiences to musical violence, or decided to focus on acoustic weapons in the shadows of World War II in your Torture project? Like, you gave an example of adding an Australian rock band, AC/DC, into the project, and including songs like Shoot to Thrill or Hell's Bells.
Sure. I won't torture you with that piece. So the work that she's referring to, I don't know if this might have been before your time, but following the Iraq War, with all of the incarceration of suspected terrorists at Guantanamo Bay, it came out that the U.S. military had been engaged in what they called no-touch torture. So these enhanced interrogation techniques, this is before waterboarding came out, allegations of, the proof of waterboarding. But they had these techniques like making the rooms really cold or leaving the lights on 24 hours a day. And one of the things that they were doing was they were blasting music at detainees. And it wasn't just that it was like this physical violence through sound. What was really freaky was the songs that they chose. So this list I've never been able to find out whether this is actually, like they found somebody's iPod or something, or if it was a joke, or like it's well documented that they did this. The songs themselves I'm not quite sure about, but all the songs had these undertones of nationalism or of some sort of like sexualized kind of content, and what there's this really interesting article on it by this scholar named Susan Cusick, and she talks about how they were doing this like violence on so many different registers because having these Muslim detainees, many of whom for religious reasons wouldn't listen to music and had very different relationships to sexuality, that to not just make their ears hurt and keep them awake, but to kind of just force them to listen to American imperialist messages and sexualized messages. And the fact of hearing music itself was a transgression. So I was just, that really made a mark on me. And so I made this piece where I took the playlist, and this is back when mashups were still a thing, and I did a playlist, torture playlist mashup. But I wanted to make it sound like it might sound if you'd never heard these songs before and you had been awake for a week straight and you were disoriented. So yeah, if you go on my site, you can listen to it if you want. You probably won't get very far because it's really awful.
Thank you.
Mitchell, thank you very, very much. And for those of you here, please join us again next week, same time, same place, for Chiaoza Terry Chow, who's coming from New York City. Thank you very much.
Thank you.